but he definitely had that killer's mentality of, I see a weakness, I'm going to exploit it.
I'm going to take him to deep waters. I'm going to drown him, not let him breathe.
California, the West Coast, has always been the cream of the crop. The best players indoors come and play here in California. You don't see very many West Coast people going over to the East Coast because typically the times that we do, we usually mop the floor over.
Hey, what's up? Welcome back to KWA Insight. Today, we see the returning champion Rooster versus Scot. Now, these elimination rounds are getting very interesting because they're 12 rounds long. Kind of changes the dynamic of the game. Strategy, gas tank comes into play big time. I think what we saw earlier from Rooster was just like a ruse. Like he was kind of holding back, trying to not really use his athleticism and speed. He tried to use his brain a little bit more. And suddenly, now that we're in these elimination rounds, we saw the old Rooster come back. The Rooster that we saw from the previous series, the Rooster that won the 10 Gs, the Rooster that basically held the clinic. And I think Scotto maybe wasn't ready for that. Like, what's your take on that?
Yeah, I mean, he obviously wasn't ready as far as his gas tank. He was done probably, I would say, maybe even a third of the way through.
Do you think that's something that Rooster kind of had in his back pocket? Like, is it something that he did, like, intentionally to Scotto?
I mean, I don't know if he did it necessarily intentionally, but because Scotto made it so visible and so known at that point, I mean, I would take advantage of it. Right. He's your opponent is telling you, I'm tired, leaning over barriers, dropping, it's all about body language, and then on top of that, him vocally signaling that he's tired.
Yeah, and both of us knowing Rooster as well as you know him, like, he's the type that is, if he smells a weakness, he smells blood in the water, he's just gonna eat, and I think that's what happened here. Like, as soon as Scotto kind of took a little breather, like, I think Rooster saw that, kept his cool, and he's like, all right, now I'm gonna deplete his gas tank. I'm gonna drain him. I'm gonna take him to deep waters. I'm gonna drown him. Not let him breathe. And I don't know. Maybe we weren't even able to see the time in between rounds. Maybe Rooster even went and got reset even faster. To make the game start quicker.
Yeah. Yeah. While some players use their opponent's weakness against them pretty vocally or pretty openly, it's almost like Patrick processes it in his head and then performs accordingly. That's what we saw here. And, there wasn't he was still having fun, still shaking hands afterwards, but he definitely had that killer's mentality of, I see a weakness, I'm going to exploit it. And it was pretty easy from then on.
And I think as soon as Scotto got tired, that's when Rooster was able to just be 2 or 3 steps ahead of him. Every time in the later rounds when Scotto got caught, it was either off to the side, completely off guard, just in a very vulnerable position. Like at some points he'd be like on the ground,
or missing shots all over the place.
Yeah, like just shots that he should have hit. Like
if he wasn't so gassed.
If I was behind that gun, there's a lot of times I'm like, oh, that was so close, and like it's just a sign of Scotto that maybe he needs to like just work on that part of his game and just work on the endurance, work on the stamina, because everything else seemed to be there. It's just like his body wasn't working with his brain anymore.
So, that's all physical. Do you think mentally he was starting to get exhausted? Maybe even before the match started?
Definitely. We have to remember that Scotto was a contestant on the KWA Gauntlet on the East Coast, which is very similar to Fight Night. And I think he actually won that series. Well, I think the first factor is that Scotto went into this knowing that he is fighting against a very seasoned player. Rooster goes as far back as, further back than me. He was already playing with you at Airsoft Playground before it became OG North. So maybe that contributed to his nerves. But maybe we could also say something about the skill level between two coasts. Obviously, the West Coast, where we're from, we've been doing this for a long time. It's where this was born, this style of play. And it's been that way for almost 20 years, I'd say. Whereas the East Coast, Milsim and that side of airsoft has been a little bit bigger. The competitive scene is growing. There are more and more competitive players, but maybe the pressure of competition and maybe the level of competition that the East Coast players are facing when they do migrate over is a little bit too advanced for them. What do you think about that?
I mean, to me, it's more than a little bit. To me, California, the West Coast, has always been the cream of the crop. The best players indoors come and play here in California. East Coast players, you see them coming over here because they want to play the best. You don't see very many West Coast people going over to the East Coast because typically the times that we usually mop the floor over there.
For sure. And hopefully we do see, more of a rise of the East Coast and we get more of a level playing field. I think it'd be very interesting to see a lot more East versus West games, specifically in Fight Night. We have a large fan base here, a large support group for our West Coast players, but we also support our East Coast players. I know the East Coast is very, very much supportive of their own, and as they should. They're a young culture, they're a young community, and I'd like to see that they have each other's backs. And you're talking about two guys that have been probably the biggest rivals in the history of this sport, and we're here together, talking about this game, and I want to see more of that rivalries, and the friendships that come from that, and the chemistry that's built over time. And I think it's gonna be very interesting once we see this whole country kind of rise up together, whether it's East, West, North, South, and then we might even see internationally a bigger picture. And I think I'm very excited for that.
For this match, we have Daniel Young going up against Xander. I think the main person we have to talk about is Xander. What did you think about his gameplay?
I think initially he did a really good job of taking Young out of his usual game. Usually you see Young do a lot of lateral movement. I think because of Xander's tendency to go after the one ball, it really did get into Young's head. You could see that Young was aware of Xander's skill and that particular skill set. So I think Young was actually playing it safe. But in playing it safe, what Xander accomplished was taking Young out of his game just for a split second. While we're talking about one balls, I think some people get a little bit obsessed with achieving a one ball kill. And I think Xander has displayed that he's capable of doing it consistently. But maybe because he was going up against Young, he felt like he has something to prove. So I felt like his ego may have gotten in the way. This caused Young to start shooting a little bit more than you would see him shooting typically. So it became a one ball shooter versus somebody who used a little bit more ammo. So as soon as Young made that adjustment, it's almost like the strength that Xander had in locking Young down with the one ball attempts ended up hurting him in the later rounds, because you saw Young kind of turn up the pace. And it almost seemed like Young was kind of playing possum in the beginning, almost playing slower. As soon as he picked up the pace, Xander had a hard time keeping up.
Yeah, the speed really combated against that accuracy.
As soon as the speed took over, that's also when you saw Young kind of time Xander a little bit better. So what happened was Xander became predictable. He kept using the one shot. An analogy for that would be if I was in a ring and I was boxing and all this guy was doing was throwing a jab at me, what I would have to do is just, okay, as soon as he throws a jab, I'm throwing maybe a jab back, and then I'll throw a 1-2 back. If I'm not expecting anything else, that gives me more opportunities and more variations on how I can respond. I do give Xander props for trying to kind of play this one ball game with Young, but I think he trapped himself. It was really obvious that he started to get tired, but not only that, he started kind of coming up with excuses. Whether or not a gun is shooting hot shouldn't really take you out of the game like that. I don't think the pain was that high. I think Xander maybe was looking for a way out. He felt himself gassing out. He maybe felt defeated. That's the one thing that I would have done differently if I was him. I would have just really collected myself, just look inside, just search for something else. Don't just fixate on what's going wrong. Think about what you can do to kind of overcome this. The simplest thing you could have done was perhaps ask for a chrono check even. If you really felt like you were at a disadvantage and you were getting hit with a gun that was shooting hot, say something. He was already saying stuff. He was already complaining. Might as well set something to a ref, But yeah, I think it's just his gas tank ran out. And Young is just too smart of a player to fall for the same thing over and over. I think what happened with Xander is that Young allowed him to play. Young allowed Xander to play his game, almost kind of trapping him. You make him feel too comfortable in his style. And as soon as Young turned up, you could just see Xander's morale just completely dissolved, and he quit. He basically tapped out, and that's the first time we saw anything like that. So if I were Xander, moving forward, I would really work on that part of my game. Is just don't quit. No matter what happens, sometimes the chips are going to be stacked against you, and you got to make the best of that situation and fight till the end.
Yeah, and adapt, change. The one balls obviously weren't working.
Yep.
You have to change to that player, and that's where this changing on the fly, this adapting to the scenario comes into play. He should have, if I was in his position, changed and instead of one balling, countering Young's moves. One thing that I did notice about Young is he favors that right hand shooting. With the pistol, it's a little bit easier for him to switch back to left, but when he played rifle, most of his shooting came from the right hand. The couple times that he did switch to the left, Xander actually got him out. So that's one thing, if I was Young, that I would work on. Left hand shooting, pistol, it's not as big of a deal. It's more about body posture and changing and being comfortable, which he seems to be very comfortable with the pistol. But as far as rifle and other platforms go, getting comfortable with that left hand shooting. He did a great job of balancing that speed, physical speed of moving, and that speed of putting a bunch of rounds down range, and knowing your opponent. He knows Xander likes those one balls, so he was able to easily counter that with just putting more rounds down range, keeping his head there, and definitely being the more aggressive player.
Yeah,
for
it's
this
interesting
match.
you bring that up too, because it's not something I've ever really noticed from Young. In a 5v5 situation, the switching of hands doesn't seem to be a problem. Maybe there was something about Xander, his accuracy, that made Young a little hesitant to come from his weak side. So great job by Xander to kind of take away some of Young's weapons, but it was also a gift and a curse. It ended up biting him in the ass in the end. So it's a great game between two very evenly matched players, but I think the edge here was Young's experience and I guess maybe youth and just speed. Yeah.